Hey, everybody, welcome back to our last episode for our musical theory. Well, dabbling with that or dabbling in that a little bit, just to get in some the physics of music here. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about specific about some different instruments and why, maybe how instruments produce different sounds and why they do that, sort of that sort of thing. And then that's about it. This one shouldn't be as long, but we'll talk about some different kind of phenomena that have to do with the way that we perceive the sounds that musical instruments make. So just as a kind of review, kind of catching you up from the last video, just a reminder that there's three basic categories of instruments that generate different pitches. So we've got strings, open pipes, and closed pipes. That stringed instruments tend to construct stringed instruments tend to resonate with or create standing waves with nodes at either ends, and then open pipes have these antinodes at either ends, and then closed pipes like clarinets and saxophones have a closed at one end and then open at the other end. So this is usually the end that you're blowing into, and then that's the horn end at the other end. So just as a kind of a thought about how this works, a couple of reminders. Has anyone ever, I'm sure some of you have, played an acoustic guitar versus an electric guitar? And if you ever play an acoustic guitar, it's actually fairly loud. That's what the body of the guitar is for, with the little hole in there, is that the body of it acts like a resonator. It's a way of allowing those waves to sort of vibrate around inside that box, and they're kind of produced out through that hole, and so that you can actually hear those sounds a little bit better. If you've ever played an electric guitar with the electricity off, not with the electricity on, because the electricity, obviously, that's what an amplifier does, is it takes those waveforms and it produces them, pumps them out through a speaker as opposed to through the instrument itself. But that's why an electric guitar, when it's not plugged in, sounds so much more tinny, right? Because there's no resonator to it. When you're talking about something like playing the different notes, what you're not doing is creating different frequencies here. You're actually creating a different like string. So if you put your fingers at different spots on the frets, you're actually shortening the string depending on what it is. And that's why as the string gets shorter, the pitch gets higher. And when it's open, you're at that fundamental lowest frequency. And then every time you put your finger down going all the way up to here, that string is just getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And then different strings, the thicknesses of the strings will vibrate differently. It's kind of like Hooke's law. It's got a different spring constant to it in a sense. So they vibrate at different rates depending on what the strings are made of, how thick, how heavy, whether they're nylon or steel, et cetera. And then you can tighten them by turning those little keys on there. And the more the tightness is on there, the tension that's in the string will create different amounts of frequency. It will change the frequency as the waves are moving through there, and creates different pitches. With a horn, or even with an instrument like this, the way that they work is they effectively change the length of the pipe. And they do that by having these different ways that they actually push these different buttons that's on there, basically. These have these very complicated sets of buttons, and there's little holes that they either open or close. And then wherever those holes are, that changes the effective length of the resonator. With these guys, they do something similar. That's why the pipe is actually kind of curled up. The bigger the instrument, the bigger the pipe is in terms of the size of the diameter, and then the number of coils that's in there may be different as well, in order to create a longer or a shorter wave length pipe. And then as you push on these little keys, 1, 2, 3, that also changes some different ways that you're actually opening and closing that pipe on the inside, changing some different airflow patterns on the inside there that allow the music to travel, the air to travel through there, and it creates different length standing waves. So we're effectively changing the length of L on all of these, even though the instrument itself isn't really changing its shape. By opening and closing these little holes on there, we're effectively changing what this is. And if you change L, then you're going to change the wavelengths and the sets of wavelengths that are capable of resonating on them. So there you go. That's how different instruments work. But that's also why, say, piccolos are smaller than flutes, different length L, right? That's why when you're talking about in the woodwinds, you go from things like a clarinet to an oboe to a bassoon, those instruments get bigger and bigger, and those resonates, the lengths get longer effectively, and it changes the pitches. The longer the instrument, generally the lower the pitch. Even the same thing is true with stringed instruments. Think about an upright bass versus a violin, that the shorter the string, the higher the pitch. And that's true even within a single guitar, right? The shorter the string, if you're pinching off that string somewhere on here, the higher the pitch it is. So just some different pieces about different types of instruments and how they produce the tones that they do. Furthermore, and you guys know this as well, that there are different qualities of tones that are produced by these things. That even if you have three different instruments, like that guitar, the trumpet, and the saxophone, whatever, clarinet, all playing the exact same note, say a middle C or a B flat or whatever you want to call it, even so, with your eyes closed, you can still hear the difference between them. And that's because instruments never produce perfect waveforms, perfect pitches, other than, say, a tuning fork, which is designed to only vibrate literally at one frequency, where you'll get this perfect sine wave. Other instruments have these more complicated waveforms that they create, even though they're playing the same pitch. And so this is due to resonance. It's due to resonance and superposition. When you get these sort of complicated interference patterns as the waves are sort of being produced and bouncing back on one another, you don't get a simple up and down sine wave. You get these little complicated sets of highs and lows. Now, with each one of these, they have the same frequency. So they'll be the same pitch. You can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 basic crests in this, whatever you want to call that frequency of 4. The flute still has the same 4 crest to it, but each of its crests has some little sub-crest to it. And I know you can't see it, but the bottom, the little troughs, would have a similar pattern to it as well. If you think about a human voice going, ah, it's going to have a similar kind of a thing where it's got 1, 2, 3, 4 general crest to it, but there's going to be a more complicated set of up and downs. And a violin, similar, where it's going to have a different sequence of vibrations. And a lot of times these are produced because of the body itself that's creating these different resonant frequencies inside the body. So what this is a complex thing it's based on superposition. But what these are called, and it's kind of right underneath my picture here, I'll move off to the side just a touch, there we go, is that there's the fundamental frequency. It's the basic 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever that frequency is, middle C or B flat. And then there's all these other little superpositions that happen. These little superpositions are called overtones. If they're just exactly the right overtones, I'm going to go back to this, where there are these kinds of overtones, these are actually called harmonics. So a harmonic is literally a different version of the same note. So if you've played musical instruments before, there's more than one way to play the note C. And in fact, there's only 8 notes, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And then you go back to A again. So A to A is a harmonic. It's literally one of these. And then A to the next A is another harmonic. And so when you start adding these patterns of harmonics and all these other complicated things together, these are called overtones. And this is actually what gives the musical instruments their different musical instrument qualities, and how you can kind of pick out the difference between a guitar and a piano, or a flute and a trumpet, even if they're playing the same thing. This is called timbre. It looks like the word timber, I know, as in like timber, like trees or something falling over, but it's actually pronounced like an eh. So it's timbre is how that is pronounced. And timbre is known as sound quality or sound tone. So kind of a cool little thing that happens with the different types of instruments. And that's why if you go look up, stringed instruments, there's 8,000 different kind of string instruments, and they all look just a little bit different. They all sound just a little bit different because of the quality of their strings, the size of the body, the shape of the body, the kind of wood that it's made from, and all of that other kind of stuff all plays into this concept of timbre, because each different instrument is going to have a different set of overtones to them. Going along with that is that concept of playing more than one note at the same time. This is kind of more like, why is it that certain notes sound good when you play them together, and certain notes don't sound very good when you play them together? When two notes sound bad together, that's called dissonance, right? If you get a lot of dissonance, it's just called noise, and it actually just kind of physically hurts. As opposed to consonance means that you're getting more like chords, right? Where they're sounding good together. And consonance is usually due to sort of complicated patterns like this. This is not quite the same thing as just harmonics, because there's some 2 and 3 wavelength kind of patterns that are sort of sneaking around in here. And you can kind of see I've kind of labeled on here. But this is more like when you play piano, and you know how you play like every other white key? It sounds kind of good. Da, da, da. That's a major third and a major fifth. And it's because these particular wavelengths are just different enough that when you lay them on top of one another, that you get some really sort of pretty, and I'm going to put air quotes on that, pretty patterns to it, some pretty overtones as these things sort of bounce off of one another and relate to each other. They sound good together. So again, with these, again, you can kind of see how I've got them labeled. They're color coded. So if this is the fundamental frequency to it, then an octave higher would be that one. So that would be the same note, this one and this one. And then this would be a major third, where you're actually getting 1, 2, 3 half wavelengths for every 2 of these half wavelengths. And then a fifth would be 1, 2, 3, 4 related to this one. So they're actually sort of related to each other, how they all go together. So it's kind of cool. Anyway, you can go look up more information on that. I just wanted to point out that that's kind of what consonance and dissonance is. It has to do with constructive and destructive interference, basically. That when they have some interesting sorts of constructive interference, we call it consonance. And when they have less pleasant cancellations, we tend to call this dissonance. So like the pair at the bottom would be more of a dissonant pair. It would not sound very good together. And you can kind of see that the way these overlap, they're really close in wavelength. The green one, I guess there, this one is just a little bit shorter wavelength than the red one is, just a little bit longer. So there's a couple of spots where they kind of come together, and then a lot of spots where they just really don't, and they kind of cancel each other out. So that would sound like dissonance to us, and that's just not two happy tones together. So I'm going to try this and see if this actually works. I've got a lab quest here. Ta-da! Remember these guys? And this one has a way of playing some different waves together. And I'm going to play 2 notes together at the same time that have a similar pitch to it. So you can kind of see what I've got set up here. Sorry, that's a little bit hard to do. I've got one pitch that's 600 hertz and another pitch here that's 620 hertz. I'm going to play them at the same time. The 100 over here on the side just means I'm going to play them at the same noise, at the same loudness. So let me hit play and see what that sounds like. Well, actually, let me do this. Here's 600 and 600 together. So this is the same note coming out of both speakers at the same time. Okay, here are 2 different notes coming out. This is the 600 and 620 coming out. Doesn't sound fabulous, right? Here's 600 and 700 being played together. Yeah, okay. So that 600 and 700 is dissonance. They're literally canceling each other and not sounding very good. But when I did 600 and 620, it didn't really sound bad. It just sounded like vibrating, right? Kind of weird. You can start to hear that different pitch in there. And so this is actually a different thing called beat frequencies. It's actually when we're getting really close to 2 of the same, and I'm going to get them even closer yet. So this is 600 and 610 being played at the same time. And here's what it sounds like. See how the vibration kind of got a little slower? Wah, 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 wah. As opposed to brrr, it is a little bit different, right? If we get them closer yet, you can really start to hear what is called a beat frequency. So this is 600 and 604. Very close. And if you actually count this carefully, it's making 4 of those little peaks actually for every second. Here's 600 and 602. Closer together yet. 2 beats per second, 600 and 602. And then here's 600 and 601. 601. Here we go. Here we go. This is 1 beat per second. So when you get those pitches, those frequencies that are apart by one frequency, 1 hertz difference, you get this thing called a beat. And it's literally every second. Musicians will use this to actually tune instruments to one another. So if you have 2 people on 2 adjacent instruments, and they're both playing, say, a B flat, if you're a wind person, or an open A, if you're a violin person, really good instrument people that can really tell the difference by listening for that beat frequency. And you can hear that vibration. And it's literally related to constructive interference. These 2 waves that are on the screen, this top one is blue and this bottom one is red, they're off by just a tiny little bit. And so when they play on top of one another, at some spots they cancel each other out, where literally a crest and a trough overlap with one another. And then some spots, the 2 crests overlap with one another, and you get constructive interference. And then you get a little bit of destructive and then a little bit of constructive. And this sounds like louder and quieter and louder and quieter. Wah, 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 wah. And so you hear that pitch. And so you know that if you're playing it with another person, that you know you're basically the same pitch when that beat frequency gets really slow. The faster it is, the further off that you are. So it's kind of cool to hear this concept of beat frequency. But what's kind of cool about this, I'm going to show you the other thing, is you can't actually hear the difference between the 2. So hold on. I'm going to turn this back to 602. There's almost nobody I know And some of you have like really perfect pitch. You guys can probably hear this. If you're a really good musician, you may be able to hear this. Here is 600. Here's 602. I know they sound like the same pitch. They are not. And when you play them separately, you cannot hear the difference. But when you play them together, you can tell that they're not the same, that close. It usually takes about 10 hertz or so for someone with an untrained ear to be able to tell the difference in pitch. Someone with a trained ear that's been playing music for a while can hear usually within 5. So here's 2 different pitches. Here's 600. Here's 610. Right? You can do that second one just a little bit higher. So again, the difference between the two of them, beat frequencies, allows you to tell the difference between 2 tones that you can't even hear. So there you go. Some just different little interesting phenomena that have to do with music. I hope you enjoyed this. Just a little difference, a little step away from hardcore physics into some applied physics. So there you go. Hopefully you enjoyed that. And I will see you guys at the webinars. We'll have 2 this week. One will be on 15.1, and then the critical one again will be on 15.2. See you guys around.